Hey y'all, welcome to the episode. My name is Rebekah. This is 135, episode 135 of the Truth Applied podcast. I'm coming to you from a new place today. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see the background. I'm at an Airbnb in LA. We're here for a month and I'm still working. So if you're listening to this on Spotify or any other place, it's probably going to sound exactly the same. It is August 2024 if you're listening live as these episodes come out, and we are starting a new theme this month. One of my favorite things ever to talk about. Y'all know me, and I'm not going to give you my whole story from start to finish again, but if you've been around here at all, you guys know I'm 41 and I got married when I was 39. So I had a very long, my whole adult life really until about 2-3 years ago was being single. And so I love this topic. And before you tune out, if you're a married woman, I just want to really encourage you to listen to this whole month because there'll be, I think, one episode that's very specific to like dating that might not feel relevant to you, but all the other episodes, everything translates. All the principles of embracing new seasons of life, all the principles of how do we have confidence when we feel like we don't fit in certain areas, all the things I'm going to be talking about will be relevant to all phases of life, not just single women. Like I said, with the exception of, I think, one episode that I'm pretty excited about where I'm just going to really confront single women on terrible dating habits. So I did a series on singleness last summer, I believe it was a year, maybe even 2 years ago now. I can't remember. We've been doing the podcast for almost 3 years. So there's been a series. And if you want to go all the way back into some of those episodes, I'll put links or numbers in the show notes of this episode. So you can just hop right on back and listen to my whole story if you want to hear my story from start to finish. But I really want to spend this series just getting a little, I don't want to say confrontational with you guys, but definitely just kind of honestly giving myself permission to call out some things that I think people who haven't walked the single road don't feel comfortable calling out. Rightfully so. They're like, I don't know if I should say this. I don't know if I have the right to speak into these areas of their life. And so a lot of people hold back. But having walked the road for, 20 years pretty much, and now even being on the other side of it, I do feel like I have some things that I have grounds to stand on and the right to say. So let me start with today's topic of grief. One of the things that I'm thankful for and proud of about my single years is that I really did allow myself to grieve. I fought for my grief. One of the best ways that I can describe what it felt like to be a single woman in the church is, first of all, pretty invisible. I think widows probably feel that. I think single, women who've been divorced feel that. Definitely single women who've never been married. There is still, unfortunately, in most churches, though I hope the tides are changing, more value placed on marriage than placed on singleness, and more attention given to marriage and helping people have healthy marriages, which I get. I mean, now that I'm married, I understand that marriage is beautiful, but hard. And so there's a lot of focus on it. And, 99% of people in leadership at churches are married. So they're not thinking about single people. And they're not thinking about how hard singleness is. And they're not really ministering to unmarried people. Most married people think that being single is easier than being married, which is not true. I'm just going to go ahead and say that's, it's not true. And so single people don't get preached to a lot. They don't get served very much. They're very much left alone to navigate the difficulties of life and doubt and our spiritual walk, really more alone than anybody, more alone than most people will say. And so, yeah, as a single person in the church over all those years, I definitely felt invisible most of the time. I felt unsupported. But I really am in touch with my feelings and have been. It's part of what I help other people do in coaching. And so throughout the process, I knew, even though the church downplayed it, and even though I didn't really get anybody who understood or supported, and I was really alone in my grief, I knew that I was grieving. I went through 2 intense periods of grief, once when I was 27 and once when I was about 30. Gosh, I guess maybe 37, because it was very close after that I met my now husband. And I met him when I was 38. We got married when I was 39. So I'm really proud of myself, and I want to open this series by encouraging single women of all different statuses of singleness, okay, to fight for your grief. I always felt like I was battling 2 things when I was single. One was I was wrestling with the Lord. I was constantly wrestling with the Lord, constantly wrestling with, this makes no sense. Why another breakup? I thought this guy was the one. I'm trying to honor you with my life. Why are all my friends getting married? Why are my friends who are not living a righteous life or even obeying in some of the really hard sacrificial ways that I was obeying? Why are they getting married? Why are these people? Why is everybody else's life moving forward? Okay, so for years, not just like a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, for almost 2 decades, I asked these questions of God, and I wrestled with him constantly on long prayer drives and in my prayer journal and with tears that would give me a migraine. This doesn't make any sense, but I trust you anyway, is usually where I would get to. It's usually where I would get to. But there were a few seasons where, because of the passage of time, I realized that the dream I had for my life, my expectations that I had for my life, weren't going to happen. And so I was fighting that battle with God. And then I also constantly felt like I was fighting a battle with people at church who wouldn't let me be sad, who wouldn't let me have my grief, who wouldn't acknowledge that the death of a dream or the death of the way you thought your life was going to go or the death of an expectation was just as legitimate as any other major loss. Okay? People don't expect a 27-year-old to be suffering major loss. Most people don't suffer major loss. Most, not all. I don't know. Many people don't suffer heart-shattering, unfixable loss until they lose maybe a parent or, experience a divorce. Usually that level of loss comes later in life. And yet, if you're a woman who deeply desires to be married, deeply is waiting on the Lord for that, by the time you're late 20s, most of your community married and having kids, the grief is so profound because the reality hits you that I'm not going to be raising kids with, my siblings. I'm not going to be a young mom. I'm not going to be able to maybe empty nest or retire at the same pace as most of my peers. These things are profoundly isolating and profoundly worth grieving. Okay. And the church really is terrible about letting single people have their grief. Terrible. If somebody loses a person in their life, most people allow that person to grieve. They get it, but unfortunately, some people are even bad at allowing grief there. They'll be like, well, they're in a better place and you'll see them again someday. And okay, I cannot handle comments like that. But there's usually at least a little bit of understanding for someone who's lost a person. There is little to no understanding for somebody who has lost really a sense of how they thought their life would go, their dreams. There's a sense of, like I said, isolation and being left out of your peer group. There's a sense of not fitting in at church. And let me take a moment to say this really quick, because, this episode is really me encouraging you, single women, whatever you're single, however you got to your singleness, or if you're still just in it, never been married. This is me encouraging you guys to fight for your grief. Okay. But I also want to say, so over the years, and especially during those 2 seasons where the grief lasted a long time, 6 months of me not being myself, not being happy, not having energy, not even really wanting to go to church. I mean, true depression like symptoms of grief. Over the years, often felt like I was grieving alone with the Lord. Now, looking back, and this is a large part of the reason I want to encourage you guys to fight for your grief, those moments of desperation for the Lord, of needing Him so badly, of really allowing myself to acknowledge like the reality of the loss, the reality of the death of how I thought my life was going to go, the reality of all that I honestly was missing out on. No spiritual bypassing. No, well, God is enough. God won't give you more than you can handle. No, well, there's still a chance to get married someday. Well, you could always adopt. Well, marriage is hard too. Okay, just the sadness and the reality that I was feeling when I really acknowledged the depth of it and the loss. And I was just desperate for God to comfort me, desperate for God to bind up my broken heart, desperate for God to make some sense of it, desperate for God to give me meaning and purpose anyway, desperate for God to speak His truth over me. Those are the moments that I cherish now more than anything. So I'm encouraging you guys to fight for your grief for a couple reasons. First of all, it is when you will get the closest to God. It is when you will know God. Like people who have not hurt on this level will never know Him. It is a grace. It is a hidden grace to suffer so deeply that, and to feel alone in your grief, and to feel misunderstood, and the isolation from almost all like human understanding and support. It is a grace because you will, like, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That's what the Bible says. And I'm not saying I want to go back to my singleness, or those years of weeping and months of sadness. But what I am saying is the richness of my relationship now with God is 100% a product of those times. And me allowing myself to be honest about the loss, to take my emotions to God, to acknowledge the reality that I was really in, to contend with Him, or to allow Him to, come in, comfort, to be my emotional support, to be the companion of my soul, to be my all in all. And I was so desperate for it. And then He met that need. Like literally everything that I have now with Him, and I have a lot. My spiritual life is extremely rich and real, the most precious thing in the world to me. And I want you guys to have that too. So fight for your grief, because it will bring you into a richness of a relationship with God and faith that we cannot produce without suffering, and we cannot produce on our own human efforts. Okay. Also want you to fight for your grief and mourn the loss in your life, mourn the sadness, or just the reality that you feel, because it's really the first step to healing. It's the first step to being able to adjust to the life that God does have for you. Okay. So yes, we mourn, but we don't mourn to stay in mourning. We mourn to acknowledge that that thing is gone. That thing is over. And we grieve and we mourn to accept what is. This is really hard for some people. I mean, in all areas of life, there's people who fight mourning and they get stuck in their grief of losing a loved one, or stuck in their grief of maybe, like I said, going through a divorce, which is a major loss. They might get stuck in their grief about a difficult health diagnosis. Allowing yourself to acknowledge that what you thought was going to be, or what used to be there, is gone, and adjusting to what is is critical. I want to read you guys something out of Deuteronomy. Ends in Deuteronomy 34. We're going to jump to Joshua chapter 1. So this is the death of Moses, okay? Moses, who had led the people all the way to the promised land, the leader of all the people. Moses dying was a great, 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 great loss for the people. And this is what the Bible says about it. In Deuteronomy 34, verse 5, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And they buried him in the valley of the land of Moab. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses had ended. I'm going to give you guys in this series like so much good stuff to help you love and embrace being single. But we cannot get to that point if you haven't done this first. If you haven't acknowledged what is gone, acknowledged what is dead, and allowed yourself time to mourn. I don't know if you practically, want to try to give yourself 30 days or something. You can't. Mourning is very individual and specific, and it's not anything that you can really put a timeline on or rush. I mean, back in the day, they used to say you got 30 days, or even in like Victorian times, women would wear black for a year, I think. And so everybody knew. And yet we're supposed to paint on a face of the opposite of black. We're not supposed to be sad, right? Supposed to be. We're supposed to put the joy of the Lord, but God could still come through, but positive vibes only, but manifest your husband. Oh my gosh. That's a whole different topic. And I want to give you the permission to put on the metaphorical black clothes if you haven't done it yet, if you haven't acknowledged it yet, and let yourself be sad and let yourself face the reality. Don't give in to self-pity, meaning you are not the only person who's suffered. Okay. It can be real. Satan can play in our grief and say, God is being mean to you. Nobody else has it this hard. And he can take us from a healthy grieving to a place of self-pity that makes us, it's just not healthy. So I'm going to take this moment to be really direct with you guys and say, you're not the only person who's had the loss of a dream. You're not the only person whose life hasn't gone the way that you expected it to go. You're not. Okay. And if you think you are, you're comparing yourself to very few people and probably people whose lives you don't even know behind the scenes. Okay. I did it. I gave into self-pity a few times during my singleness, but it never produces anything good. Healthy grief produces healing. It produces really empowerment. It produces acceptance. But to sit around and basically tell God that he's been unfair to you and to get mad at God to the point that you don't move through it is a problem. If any of you are there or stuck there, we can do some coaching. I can help you through that. But for the sake of today's episode, fighting for your grief, have you done it? Have you let yourself grieve? I mean, whatever situation you find yourself in right now, listener, have you tried to spiritually bypass it? Or have you said, okay, you know what? I'm going to lean into the fact that X, Y, and Z, and you do need to name it. Name and accept the reality of the loss. Any loss. Let yourself grieve it, even if well-meaning Christians around you don't, or make you feel like you're not allowed to grieve it. There's so much grief and lament that happens in the Bible. So turn your eyes to the Bible to guide you in your expression of your lament or your loss. And then, okay, so the people grieved for 30 days. And then in Joshua chapter 1, we read this. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all the people, into the land that I'm giving you. Friends, in our life, on this side of heaven, there will be so much loss and so much grief. There will also be so much joy and so much love. And there will be something that God is waiting to give you. But you have to grieve, have to acknowledge your reality, and then you have to arise. So not only am I very proud of myself for grieving when I was single and grieving deeply on 2 different occasions, because it's one thing to grieve the loss of like, oh, I thought I was going to be married young. It's another thing to grieve again when you're in your late 30s and go, okay, I thought I was at least going to be married in my 30s. We're now 10 more years passage of time, 10 more years behind my peers, 10 more years of what feels like loss and wasted time or whatever. Okay. I am so thankful that the Lord led me mourn, but I'm also thankful that the Lord called me to rise. And I didn't fight him on that. So here's where some of you are at. Some of you have never mourned. You're afraid to go there. You're afraid that people will think you're weak. You're afraid of how it'll make you feel and that you'll maybe never get up. Seek a counselor, seek a coach if it's really hard for you to go there on your own. Get somebody to go with you. But many of you can do this. You've just never had anybody give you permission. Well, that's what I'm doing. Okay. And then I'm also really proud of myself for not staying in the mourning and instead lifting my head. And this was all by the grace of God. I mean, God is the one who lifted my head. God is the one who comforted. God is the one who healed. God is the one who gave me any kind of strength. Like when I thought it was impossible to find any kind of happiness or meaning, I'm like, I remember telling my mom at one point, I'm like, there's no way my life could be okay now, because there's just no way my life is ever going to be okay if I can't have some of these things. And now with the passage of time, I'm not going to have them. That's how it feels in the moment. There's no way for this to be redeemed. I know God can make beauty out of ashes, but he can't turn back time and make happen what I wanted to have happen. I remember feeling that way, but there came a moment after my grief, after my loss, after my mourning, that I really did what God, by his grace, and I pray this for all of you guys who are listening this month, that by his grace, he allowed me to do, he empowered me to do what he told his people here to do. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise and go over the Jordan, you and all the people, to the land I'm giving you. So this is what this looks like, ladies, when we fight for our mourning. We come to a moment where we stand, literally get back up. Okay. And it's such an interesting and beautiful picture, because for me, mourning often was laying on the floor, like in a ball, crying. But then our comfort is received and our peace is found and some confidence is restored, and we arise. And we have to look at our God and say, I'm acknowledging the reality of this death. And then I'm also looking you in the eye and saying, well, then what is the land you have for me? And this is where most people get stuck. Okay? If you want this promised land, and what that means practically for us women, this means a new hope, a new purpose. This means true sense of identity. This means community in a different format. This means, yes, God can bless you. Yes, your life can be great. Yes, you can have meaning. But that only happens when we acknowledge what is not there. We keep our faith in God and we look God in the eye, so to speak, and we say, then what is the land you have for me? Okay? I've grieved with you. I'm rising again and I'm saying, okay, if you say you're good, you say that you're for me, you say that you see me, I'm calling in on all these promises. I'm cashing in on all these things that you say. You even say singleness is a gift. What? It doesn't feel like a gift, but I'm standing here before you and I'm saying, I believe then that you have something for me. And you have to get to the point where you open yourself up to him being right and you not being right. You have to open yourself up to the point that you say, I mean, think about what these people were going through here. Moses, their leader, 40 years, their connection to God. Right before they go into the promised land, he dies. And they mourn and they weep, and yet they go, okay, plot twist, major adjustment. But God said, go into the promised land anyway. Go inhabit the land. Take what I've given you. Are you willing to do both of these things, ladies? Are you willing to mourn and acknowledge the reality of your life, even if it makes you feel sick to your stomach? Okay. Absolutely, unequivocally sick to your stomach. And then are you willing to arise and look God in the eye and wait in expectation for the fact that he has something for you? It's just probably not going to be what you thought. But do you believe it can still satisfy you? Do you believe it can still give you connection so that you don't feel alone? Do you believe that your life can move forward in a good and beautiful way when it doesn't fit your definition of what you thought good and beautiful was going to be? I am so glad that he helped me through this process when I was single. I am so glad that I can talk to you guys about it now, because I hope that it's helping some of you who might be stuck or have been stuck for years, either because you refuse to grieve or because you refuse to acknowledge that he has a different land for you. I look back, like I said, on my singleness, and it never got 100% easy. I mean, even all the way up into the time that I got married, this was still happening in kind of micro cycles. Okay. So I had ministry going on. I had mission trips I'd been on. I had community. I'd really embraced being single, and I loved many things about being single. And I had all of the Lord. He had given me all of himself, and we were tight, and I had nieces, and like my life was really, really very, very good. But I call them micro cycles of, but then I would still have to kind of like re-trust God again and re-grieve again. This is just life, you guys. This is just life. There is a desperation for God and a richness of a relationship that you can have with God that I think only single men and women, a certain depth or richness or knowing that comes from single. And I want you guys to have the fullness of that blessing. And I believe that this is the way to do it. Mourn, fight for your grief. Don't let the church steal it from you, and then arise and go take the land that God has for you. And even when you're in that land, because I know many of you are, I know a lot of my listeners, I mean, as a single woman, you're going to fall into one of these three categories. You've never let yourself grieve, so you're stuck pretending and playing like a good, happy Christian. Or you've let yourself grieve and you've never gotten to the point where you stand up and arise and allow God to show you what he does have for you. Okay. Because he does have something for you. It's not like an accident that you're single. It's not like he literally had a plan for everybody else's life but yours. It's not like he actually just forgot about you. No, he still has a plan for your life, and he still has a land for you to take, and you need to stand up and take it. Okay. But even when we're in that land, because I existed for a lot of my singleness in the land, I moved through my grief. I was like, okay, God, I trust you. Deliver me to what you have for me. And he did. Even in that land, I want to speak to you really quick. Those of you who are in that space, it's still going to be hard. Okay. There's still going to be seasons where you have friends that are getting engaged, friends getting married. Christmas comes around again for the 15th or 20th time. And you're still having, Christmas with your parents because everybody else has somewhere to go with their 5 little kids and you don't. So there's still going to, even when we're existing in the place of relying on God's faithfulness, living out his plan for our life, we will still need him. You'll never not need him. And that's okay too. That's okay too, right? Then you have the micro cycle of like, I just need to go cry today. And God will comfort me and I will grieve, and he'll give me he'll tell me to arise, and he'll remind me of the land right in front of me, and I'll be okay. But that's life. If you guys think that this message will bless just anybody, Anybody who's going through something hard, I want to encourage you to send it to them. Because in a world that tells us we should force good feelings, and in a church that tells us if we had more faith, we would be happy all the time, I'm reminding you guys that the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says that acknowledging loss and grieving and mourning and lament are powerful expressions that validate what we've been through, that validate a loss, that help us heal, that help us accept the life that really is in front of us, and that give us time and space to grow with the Lord in ways that just pretending like everything is okay will never do. So this is the deepest of the episodes. I would say the heart level, emotional, I see you, I know what you're going through episode for this series. The series is going to get lighter and kind of funnier and more fun and more practical, but I just had to start with I do see you, and more importantly, God sees you, and also you're not alone. And please grieve, but please don't give in to self-pity, and do exactly what God had his children do. Acknowledge that loss, grieve, arise, and then take the land that God does have for you. Okay? You are not the only woman or man who's had to do this in your life, and you will regret it if you put it off for too long. You will regret it if you spend 20 years of your life fighting this reality. You will regret it. Okay. If any of you need to talk, do book a discovery call, because I know this topic is so tender and so sensitive. And most of us are, if you haven't really found your people who are either walking the walk with you or have people in your life who get it, many of you are probably feeling very unsupported and very disconnected from people who, just unsupported and disconnected. Okay. I don't want you to feel unsupported or disconnected. So see you guys next Monday.